You know, the thing that inspires me most about music is that it says absolutely nothing. I've always been bothered by the notion of music as a language. I mean, there are elements of language, of course, certain kinds of syntax and grammar, but you can't order a coffee with music. You can't give someone directions with music. You can't even really tell someone how you're feeling. I think for me, the perfect example of this is that I tend to associate major and minor keys with, major music is happy and minor keys are sad. But really, I think some of the saddest music I've ever heard is music in a major key. I think what's beautiful about music is that it communicates nothing. There's no meaning behind what we hear. But essentially what we have are two competing elements, and great composers are aware of this. One of those elements is what you know, and the other element is what you don't know. Great composers give you, or sort of set you up in a space where you feel comfortable. They teach you motives, they teach you, kind of a tonal area. Right? We're in C major. We're comfortable now. But then great composers also know when to kind of twist the knife. They know when to introduce something that makes your sense of what's comfortable, of what's home, of what's familiar, start to crumble a little bit. We returned home, but we're not the same person we were when we left. Definitely. We started in a C major, but then some things happened that really kind of shattered our sense of what was home, what was comfortable. The most beautiful element, the most beautiful technique in all of tonal music is chromatic modulation. Chromatic modulation is really, before when I've talked about augmented sixth chords, I said that augmented sixth chords were sort of like getting towards the end or pointing towards the end of diatonic harmony, because essentially these are chords that don't make sense in the same way that other chords do. It's essentially voice leading that has been locked in amber. Chromatic modulation really is the moment that diatonic harmony fails. It just breaks completely. We have absolutely no clear sense of what's up, down, right, or left. And I wanted to show you something. It's sort of the image that I have when I think about chromatic modulation. I just searched for a non-Euclidean game, Euclidean space kind of referring to geometry that we're used to. So, right angles, perspective, things that make sense to us because that's how we experience the world on a daily basis. There's a whole bunch of examples of this, but this top one here, and I'll link to this video in the description.
First example is this tunnel. You can see it's really long from the outside, but it's actually really short on the inside.
I think that right there is like the perfect example of a chromatic modulation. You have a chord that is functioning in one way in one universe, and that chord functions in a completely different way in another universe. The kind of incomprehensibility of that moment when you pass from one to the other. If you take nothing else from these classes on diatonic theory, it's that great composers are manipulating you. I want you to be able to look at a score and just be able to identify, like, okay, this moment here is special because what the harmonies are doing is like kind of beyond what we expect in this sort of grounded corporeal existence that we call everyday life. What I wanted to do in this video is look at some repertoire and just show how the whole idea of chromatic modulation has changed from, well, the first example is Mozart here, all the way until the late 19th century. I'll show you some Schumann examples, there's some Liszt, there's some Beethoven. Then we'll talk about some especially weird examples, maybe kind of pointing more towards the post-tonal. So let's look at this first example. This is the Mozart Kegelstatt Trio, viola, clarinet, and piano. Really beautiful piece. This is just at the very end of the development of the first movement, so take a listen to it. This is a pretty straightforward example. So we start here in C minor. What we have is essentially sort of little mini tonicizations of 5. So we have 5 here, and then these little moments of, let's just call them a kind of 7 diminished 7. It's missing a note. We're missing the A in order to have the diminished 7, but it's 7 diminished 7 of 5, an inversion of that. In this case, I think it would be 4/3. But in any case, we're tonicizing 5 in C minor. So really, we have 5, 5, 5. We have a little turn. Then we have the equivalent of 5. Remember that any dominant harmonies are sort of interchangeable with each other. The other dominant harmony in C minor is 7. If we write the notes out from top to bottom, or bottom to top, we can see that we have F, A, B natural, D. So this is a 7 diminished 4/3. We have a little bit of 1 here. That's it's just 1, 7 diminished 4/3 again. Then we keep going. Then we have what looks like, if we're still thinking from the perspective of C minor, we have what looks like 5, 7 of 3. But we also have this other little chord in between. Mozart's very clever to put this here. Remember, what we really need in order to modulate, to properly modulate from one key to another, so we need tonic, subdominant, and dominant in the new key. So we need to have proof. We have to have enough information to say that we are now in this key. We have what is essentially a little bit of, if we're thinking from the perspective of E-flat major, which is where we end up, we have a little bit of modal mixture. This is 2 half diminished 7. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense in C minor, because if I write this chord out in C minor, so we have this. In C minor, this would essentially be 4 half diminished 7, which means it has a C flat in it, which is, as you know, not diatonic in C minor or C major, right? That this is a little bit of nonsense. This doesn't make any sense in the context of C minor. When you start to see chords that make no sense whatsoever in the key you thought you were in, that's the moment when you should say, hey, I think I'm in a new key now. So let's get rid of this. So let's actually call this bar here 5, 5, 7. We are already kind of operating in E-flat major. We just have to figure out when we switched to E-flat major. Let's just say E-flat major has already happened. So let's back up to something that could potentially be both in C minor and E-flat major. You have to start to be able to respell chords in your head. It's just something you have to do. So let's look at this bar here. If I write out, and I'm going to make a little staff here, 7 diminished 7 chord in C minor, is there any way I can respell this chord so that it's something that we would get in E-flat major? Well, remember that a diminished 7th chord has potentially 4 leading tones in it, depending how you spell it. So currently we have a leading tone in the bottom, and that's the leading tone to C minor. But if we look up this chord, we can see that D here that D is the leading tone in E-flat major. So we just have to respell this chord so that it's a leading tone 7th chord, leading tone diminished 7th chord in E-flat major. And so if we put that leading tone on the bottom, which is how a 7 diminished 7 chord is spelled, and then respell this B natural as a C flat, now we have our 7 diminished 7 in E-flat major. Really where this happens is right over here. So in C minor, we have our 7 diminished 4-3, and then in E-flat major, again, if we respell this in our minds, we have our 7 diminished 6-5. It's the same chord resolved to C minor, or, right? Same chord, same notes, same sound, but if we respell it, it can go in 2 different directions. So we have 7 diminished 6-5. We can then substitute that with 5, since, you know, dominant chords are interchangeable with each other. And now we're in E-flat major, perfect authentic cadence, such as it is. Okay, so this is a straightforward example. We just took one 7 diminished 7 chord, respelled it, it gave us a 7 diminished 7 chord in a different key. You'll find that 7 diminished 7 chords they're like the quickest toolkit for jumping from one key to another. Because remember, any of these 4 notes could be a leading tone in 4 different keys: C, E flat, G flat, F sharp, or A. So we have those 4 different keys we could switch into. All right, next example. So this is the Beethoven Piano Sonata in A flat. It's a beautiful piece. First movement is really beautiful piece. So this is the slow movement from that sonata. It's this very dark piece in A flat minor. How's that for a key? All right, so let's take a listen to this. Now, before you listen to it, the first thing you can do when looking for any kind of like weird chromatic modulations is just look at the page. Just look at it and let your eyeballs kind of trace, are there places where there are lots of accidentals? And since we're in a minor key, you have to assume that there's going to be one accidental at least that you're likely to see quite often, and that's the leading tone, right? In this case, in A flat minor, A flat minor, that's going to be G natural. So this is normal. This note, this accidental, that's diatonically in A flat minor. Anything else you start to see, any other odd things, you should immediately think, okay, magic. Something weird happened here, something interesting. Okay, let's just take a listen to this. etc., etc., etc. I don't need to go through and analyze everything. We know it's an A-flat minor at the beginning. Beethoven proves it to us. Right? Mostly we just get tonic dominant, but you know, we can kind of assume we're an A-flat minor. Where things start to become a little bit interesting is in bar 5. So anytime you see this, so this is a minor 5. Anytime you see a minor 5, either you have contrapuntal harmony happening, this sort of chord progression where you have a minor 5 chord where the bass line is just kind of passing through it, or we're in a different key. We've modulated. Minor 5 is often an indication that we have moved to a different key where it is actually no longer 5, it's something else entirely. Now, in this case, these are actually passing tones right here because we still have the A-flat in the bass there. But in the next bar, right here, that's minor 5. So at this point we should be thinking, okay, we're probably in a different key. There's no stepwise motion in the bass line. Something has happened. So let's look ahead and see if we can find a cadence. Because usually when you find a cadence, that's most likely what key we're in. Then you kind of work your way backwards. So there's a cadence. So this is a 5/7 in the key of C flat major. So if we back our way up, so we have 2, 6, 5, and then we have a sort of a 5, 5, 4. There's a suspension in there. This thing, that's a little suspension. It's a 5, 4. That means that this is 6. That means this is 1. That means this is 3. What we decide to call a pivot is generally up to you. I look for the chords that are most stable on both sides of the equation. So we started in A-flat minor, we've ended up in C-flat major. So what are the most stable chords in each? That means I'm probably going to avoid looking for 3. Probably going to avoid looking for 5 to 1, because that's a sort of unstable pivot chord, but you know, you take what you can. You look for the most stable chords that you can. So, and essentially you go backwards until you can't go backwards anymore. So 3, this is again in the perspective of C-flat major. This is 6 in C-flat major, and then this chord here, this would be, you know, 3 sharp, which is possible, but that's starting to get a little bit weird. So once things start to get a little bit weird, stop. Because if it makes more sense in the other key than it does in this new key, there's no reason to keep analyzing backwards. So this we know for sure is 5 in A-flat minor, and this is 1 in A-flat minor, but C-flat major, this is 6. And this now starts to make sense. Oh, sorry, I wrote a minor 1. I don't know why I did that. That should be a major 1. And then we have our pack. Okay, so not really exactly a chromatic modulation yet, except right here. So this is one way you can do a chromatic modulation, is to do a sort of normal diatonic modulation and then modally mixture into the parallel key, into the parallel minor. So we've ended up in C-flat major. Beethoven has now slipped us into C-flat minor, which would be a terrible thing to have to spell. You would have C flats and E double flats and G flats, and it'd just be a giant mess. So he respells it as B minor. B minor. So C flat minor equals B minor. This is an enharmonic equivalent. Remember that I said when something like this happens, that is diatonically impossible. At least thinking of it from the old Greek mathematical ways of thinking about this. So here is a place in my score when I'm learning this piece where I would write magic. Something weird has happened. So this is now 1, minor 1. We can kind of keep going through this, but he does basically the same thing that he did at the beginning, only now up a minor third. Things start to change a little bit down here. We have 4 now in our B minor. Okay, and now we have what looks like a 3-6-4 chord. Okay, so it's a 6-4 chord. We're going to have to figure out what kind of 6-4 chord it is. And now we have a 7 chord and then a 3 chord. So this is weird. This doesn't make any sense. This is a little bit baffling. At this point, we should think, is there a simpler way to describe this? And sounds a hell of a lot like a cadence, which probably means we are no longer in B minor, but in fact in D major. So let's just assume D major. Let's work backwards. Here's 5. Here's our cadential 6-4. So I'll actually get rid of this, write it out properly, 6-4, 5-3, which then means that this is 2, which is also 2, which in B minor was 4. So we have found our pivot. It's perfectly, we could keep going back. This is 1 in B minor and 6 in D major, but there's no reason to keep going back. The moment you find something that is a sensible pivot, remember I said this is sort of the moment some things kind of sounded like they changed, right? We had a whole lot of 1-5, 1-5, 1-5, then here's a 4 chord. I think that's a pretty reasonable pivot. That's what it sounds like anyway. All right, so we've had a whole bunch of, basically sensible modulations, but let's keep going. Let's look at what happens next. So we have this D. Okay, this is peculiar. Let's write this chord out. So if we write this chord out, and we're going to try to find its root position, D natural, F natural, A flat, C flat. The way Beethoven has spelled this is pointing towards E flat, which is weird in a D major setting. So we should immediately be thinking, because Beethoven knew how to spell things. The spelling of chords is absolutely a musical choice. Composers know what they're doing when they spell chords in a specific way. They want you to be thinking this chord is pointing towards this specific next chord. That's why it's really important to remember that enharmonic equivalents are just not a thing really until the 20th century. A flat and G sharp are not the same thing. So let's look and see where this ends up. We have this chord, let's just call it a 7 diminished 7 of E flat. That's what we want. That's where it wants to go. Now we have a 5-6 of E flat. Okay, now we have another 7 diminished 7 of E flat. So, and there's E flat. Okay, so E flat. Now we have the same chord again, this 7 diminished 7 of E flat. Beethoven really wants you to get the point here. He's repeating the same idea again and again. that note is not in E flat. That F flat there, and then, aha, I see. So really, we were going to end up in A flat minor again. So all this E flat business up here was actually 5 in the key of A flat minor. So how did we get to A flat minor? Well, this is another case of enharmonic respellings, especially of diminished seventh chords. So if we were to spell this diminished seventh chord in a way that made sense in D major, it would be something, there's the train going by, it'd be something like this, right? This. Right in treble clef also, we have G sharp, B natural, D natural, F to natural, almost everything, F natural. All right, that's the 7, diminished 7 of 5 in the context of D major. But if we take all those same notes and respell them, in fact, I'll make another little staff for this so we can see that transformation. So we have our G sharp, B, D, F. Now we respell it so that this is now the 7 diminished 7 of 5 in A flat minor. So that is this chord. On the piano, it's the same notes. So we have F, we have D, and then G sharp became A flat, and B natural became C flat. Same notes, sort of. If you do that again, magical transformation, it's possible. There are a couple ways we could describe this. Personally, I always think the simplest way is the best, because you can get really tied up in knots with this sort of thing. In the key of D major, this is the, 7 diminished 4, 3 of 5. And then in the key of A flat minor, this is 7 diminished 4, 3 of 5. Typically, in a diatonic setting, we do not use secondary dominants as pivot chords. In a chromatic setting, it's more possible, but still something I would avoid. Really what's happened here, I mean, this is a complicated way you could describe this. Really what's happened here is that we have a common tone modulation. So we have a D here in this chord. We also have a D in this chord. And that gives us the ability to now switcheroo into a different key. Now we have a bunch of modulations on the page, right? So we had A flat minor to C flat major. Diatonic, that's pretty straightforward. That's a closely related key. Then Beethoven switched that for B minor. It's like this is not what you paid for. This is not what you thought you were going to get. You paid for C flat major, and instead you got B minor. It's kind of a cruel trick. But we got there in a very sensible way. Then B minor to D major, similar, closely related. It's the relative major. That's pretty straightforward. We end up in D major. And then again, with that common tone, Beethoven sort of slips you into something you didn't pay for, you didn't expect to get. And through that common tone, we end up in A flat minor. So I'll show you a chart of how this plays out. We start in A flat minor. Then we end up in C flat major. This then gets respelled as B minor. Then we modulate, and I'll put a little line to show that we modulate to D major. Then, similarly, we use this common tone connection to get us 7 diminished 7 of 5. Then we have 5. Then we have 1. Okay, so this is essentially our little plan here. A-flat minor to C-flat major. Switch to B minor. Didn't put an accidental here. B minor to D major. D major, or the D in D major, becomes the root of this 7 diminished 7 chord of 5. Okay, let's hear that one more time. So what we start to see here, from this to this to this, we start to hear the beginnings of equal divisions of the octave. This is something I'll come back at the end of this video. Remember, I think I showed you in class, equal divisions of the octave are, diatonically speaking, impossible. So if you have equal divisions of the octave, it's magic. This is the beginnings of a magical chord progression from A-flat to C-flat to E double flat or D. Okay? All right, so now we have more Beethoven. This is the Piano Sonata, Opus 110 in A-flat major. This is after the recapitulation in the first movement, so the main theme has come back. A main theme is... Okay, that's how the piece starts. So at this point in the piece, we're in D-flat major. So I'll just play this a little bit, you listen to it. Okay, E major. We ended up in E major. And I should say the key signature is still A-flat major, but I know at this point in the piece that we are in D-flat major. So just keep that in mind, and we can see Beethoven is adding all the accidentals in that we would need in order to be in D-flat major. So again, we start in 1. Beethoven loves tonic-dominant relationships. It's an integral part of his music in the sense that I've mentioned this before, that the relationship between the tonic and the dominant is the most truthful relationship in music. And so we have 1, then we have 5, 4, 3, with a little suspension up here. Then we have 5, 4, 2, which must resolve to 1, 6. So very simple. Okay, very simple little progression there. And essentially what we've done, if we respell this chord here in the context of D-flat major, so this is a D-flat minor chord, a mixture chord from the parallel minor of D-flat minor, parallel key of D-flat minor. Beethoven knows where he's going. He's going to end up in E major, right? This is going to be 1 eventually in E major. Rather than writing it as a D-flat minor chord, he respells it completely from the point of view of E major. So we would still say that this is little 1, 6 from the perspective of D-flat minor. This is not notated, this is not spelled as if it's D-flat minor, but we know if we enharmonically respell these notes that this would be D-flat minor. But from the perspective of E major. This is now 6, 6, 5, 6. Then we have 1. So we have our subdominant, dominant, tonic. We have everything we need in order to be in the new key. So let me play that progression. So D flat major. Mixture chord, D flat minor, little 1. Now pivoting to E major, which is 6, 6. Now 5, 6. We have, this is actually not a cadence because this is not a root position chord. Remember, in order to have a cadence, you need it to be a root position 5 chord into a root position 1. That's an authentic cadence. But functionally, tonally, we're in E major, without any doubt here. I suppose Beethoven could have spelled this or written this out as a, F flat major if he felt like it. But, you got to remember that, and this is why I always am saying sharps go up, flats go down. Sharps have a different kind of musical connotation than flats. Sharps have a sort of upwards direction, upwards motion, upward sensation. Flats have a sort of downward sensation. This is the tradition, the tonal tradition. So that he wrote it as E major has certain kind of emotional connotations. How you notate something is not just a question of how easy is it to read, but also a question of what are you trying to tell the performer. Okay, so that's this example. Let's go on to the next. So this is from the same sonata, from the last movement. So I'll play this. So incredible. This is really the lowest point of the piece. It's devastating, this moment right here. And the music changes such that it's just like, it's like you just you have barely any breath left. You're just sort of exhaling your last breaths. It's incredibly pathetic, as in pathos. There's a whole lot of pathos in this. So look for cadences or the suggestion of cadences. That very strongly wants to resolve to something. There, wants to resolve there. So we can assume at this point that we're in A flat major, but kind of based on where we end up. So a bunch of stuff happens up here. This is all kind of diatonic and A flat major. I don't really need to go into this, but we have a 5, 4, 2 of 4, and then a 4, 6, and then a little, well, it looks like it's a mixture, 2 half diminished, 4, 3, etc., etc. It doesn't really matter. This is all kind of A flat stuff. A flat major stuff happens. And really, let's analyze this right here just to sort of know where we end up. So we have 7 diminished 7 of 6. We have 6. Then we have 4. Then we have 5, 6, 5 of 5. Then we have 5. And then we add a 7 to it. And then this is all 5, 7, 5, 7, 5, 7, 5, 7. And then, well, I mean, from the perspective of A flat major, this is not anything in particular. This is, I mean, what would we call this? 7 natural 5. Something's off. This is a 5-7 chord a 5/7 chord does not go to this thing. Right, this is, also this is a, God, I don't even know what to call this, because this is a 6/4 chord. So we can already see something has happened right here, something crazy. So if we look at this chord, we know it ends up in G minor, right? G minor. Beethoven is being pretty clear about that. This is G minor. What sort of dominant sounding sonority would land us into 6/4 chord? If it's a 6/4 chord, it must be a kind of 6/4 chord, which presumably means it must be a cadential 6/4 if we end up in G minor. Now, Beethoven is doing some kind of weird stuff here, as Beethoven tends to do, so we'd assume this is a cadential 6/4, but if we look ahead, there's no 5 chord. Right, we should be getting a 5 chord here somewhere. So Beethoven has kind of given us a frustrated cadential 6/4. This is a cadential 6/4 that doesn't do what the cadential 6/4 is supposed to do. That also, when you need to be looking for what is this chord expected to do, and what does the composer actually do? The composer doesn't actually do what he's supposed to. That's a message from Beethoven of just how devastating and kind of empty and depressed this music is right here, is that it doesn't behave as it should. I'm not actually really sure what to call this 6/4 chord. I guess we could call it, some kind of an arpeggiated 6/4 chord. But I'm kind of getting a little bit off topic here. What kind of dominant 7th sounding chord resolves into a 6/4 chord, or a cadential 6/4, a German augmented 6th, right? If we think of this from the perspective of G minor, that would be spelled, let me zoom in on this so you can really see it, would be spelled like this. We have that augmented 6th on the outside, slips out into what we expect to be our cadential 6/4. So if we take this C sharp here and respell it, we get a D flat. And this here, another magical juncture. Literally, write this stuff in your score. When you see things like this happening, it's magic. It's such an incredible shift. And also that frustrated cadential 6/4, right? We don't get a 5. That to me is actually, just looking at this, the most astonishing part of this chord progression is just like how empty it feels. Respelling German augmented 6 chords. It's a common trope. All right, so now, speaking of magic, this is one of my favorite pieces. I can kind of noodle through this, but I think it's probably better to listen to a real recording of it. So I'll play that now. Okay, so we can see at the beginning here some kind of a cadence, a half cadence of some kind. This piece is in C major. So this is some sort of a half cadence in 5. Here's a 5 chord, here's another 5 chord. we can presume this is some sort of a, 7 diminished, 7 something of 5, right, over a G pedal. Doesn't matter. We end up in 5. There's a G. What key are we in? We're just suddenly in E-flat major. We're just in E-flat major. We just kind of appeared there. It's like we just, we just turned a switch, flipped a switch, now we're here. So this is E-flat major. So this is 1. Then we have a sort of like a 4-6 thing going on. Then we have 5-6, then 1. Then we have a kind of 2-6 situation. There's other little details in between, and then we end up in what sounds like 5 of 6. All right, we're expecting to get a C minor chord, but instead, what we actually get is 1. We get E flat again. So, which means, because the secondary dominant is not resolving where it's supposed to, we're just going to call it what it is, which in this case is 3 natural, right? E flat major, 3 is G minor, we raise the 3rd, now it's G major, and it's just 3. It just does the things that 3 does. Yes, I know there's a little moment of 6 here, but this is kind of the game that Schubert plays when he has these chords that hint that they might do something, and in fact they don't do that thing, really. They just are themselves. Metaphor for how he felt about himself. Somebody who didn't really fit into society and didn't really have a clear place in society. Lived as an outcast most of his life. So this is why he likes chords that are kind of outcast chords, chords that don't do what they're expected to do. So anyway, how did we get into E-flat major anyway? Like, what the hell is going on? Truly kind of my favorite kind of modulation. We already sort of had one earlier. This is what we would call a common tone modulation. Basically, we had G, ended with a G. That G is, the tonic in this, locally in this space anyway. And now we reinterpret that G as scale degree 3 in E flat. And now we're in E flat. So rather than having a pivot chord, we have pivot tones. If you can find a tone that belongs, sort of normally in the previous key, and now also belongs in the next key, there's your pivot tone. Now, I mentioned this about pivot or common tone chords, or Tchaikovsky example. Generally, you want the previous tone, the tone as it exists in the previous key, to be the tonic, and then it's a different scale degree in the new key. So that's sort of the formula that we have: the tonic, the root, something that is stable, which is then reinterpreted as something less stable. So in this case, we're going from scale degree 1 to scale degree 3 in E flat. These are amazing because they just kind of happen. Schubert loves them. So here we end in C major, let's just say. It just uses those common tones. Think of them like pedal points, sort of. It's a sort of a turn key. You're able to turn that key, open a door, and travel to another universe. Magic. Okay, so let's go on and see how Schubert makes his way back. There we go. All of a sudden, right? It's again, the pivot is that G. So we went from, I'll just write this out. We had an E flat major chord. Then we have a C major chord. And here the common tone was G. Same as before, it was G up here that got us into E flat major, and now it's G that's going to get us out of E flat major. Okay, simple as that, right here. Magic. All right, let's go on. So now we have this Liszt example. I think maybe I'll just talk through this as I play it. So Liszt is really kind of a harmonic modernist in the late 19th century, and he's doing all kinds of crazy stuff before composers we typically associate those techniques with are even dreaming of them. So Liszt, in terms of a whole lot of early 20th century techniques and concepts, Liszt was thinking about it first. Okay, D flat major. Pretty straightforward. That's really what he's telegraphing to us. So we have 1, then we have a kind of a 7 half diminished 7 of 5 over a D flat, and then we have a, sort of a 5 4 2. Now we have this delicious non-chord tone. We could think of this as a suspension, right? I think it is. We have this note in the previous bar, that F, and it holds over, resolves to the E flat. Then we have 1. Okay, we're in D flat major. Then again, same thing. 7 half diminished 7 of 5. What sounds like it anyway. Okay, well that's different. That's a cadence of some kind, I think. Sounds like it. Let's go on and see what happens. Okay, so we're definitely in F minor. I mean, it's stuck. That's really the difference between a tonicization and a modulation is, did it stick? Tonicizations are brief. They tend to, we sort of pretend like we're in that key and then we just slip back out of it. This one has stuck. I guess it's the difference between plasticity and elasticity, right? You bend something just enough, but if you bend it too much, you go past that point of elasticity into plasticity, then you've bent it permanently. It's not coming back anymore. So at this point, let's back up and find a pivot chord. So, I mean, that's still what that was, but if we had a 1 chord here, so we need to find our cadence. This is our 5, 7, and then 1 from the perspective of F minor. Again, we don't really want to be pivoting on secondary dominants, that they're not stable. We always want to be looking for stable pivots between one chord to another. 1 is the same as 6 in F minor. That's a pretty stable pivot. It's simple, it's direct. Always look for what's simple, always look for what's going to cause your brain and your ears the least complication. Let's just go with that. So that means that this chord then, in F minor, if we write this out in root position, this is in fact 2 half diminished 4/3 or something like that. With the D A-flat in the bottom, right? Strong predominant, and then we get our 5. Okay, we're definitely in F minor. All right, so let's see what happens. We got a little hint of 5-7 here, back to 1. Another hint of 5-7. Ooh. Interesting. We have essentially mixture 1, right? Okay, well, so wait, I didn't sign up for this. I signed up for F minor. So we're definitely in F major now. We've really kind of switched into the parallel mode. F major, must be F major now. You know, we have notes that are kind of belonging to 4. I mean, this is really sounding like F major. And then we get, okay, this is interesting, 3, 6, 4. That's definitely not something we could have in F minor, this A minor chord, right? That would be a really funky thing to write out. So, you know, rather than thinking of this in the perspective, from the perspective of F minor, in which 3, an A minor chord, would be natural 3, natural 5. Like, we'd have to make all these qualifications of what it is. At this point, let's just reestablish what the actual mode is. It's F major at this point. Okay? So we have, it's like a modal mixture that has now stuck. So this is now 3, 6, 4. So remember, it's a 6-4 chord. We're going to have to figure out what kind of 6-4 chord it is. We can't just leave it at that. It's doing something. So what's it doing? Let's see what comes next. Okay, so now we have 5 of 3, and then a cadence into 3. And then if we keep looking ahead, okay, we have a lot of stuff that's pointing at 3. It's 3, 3, 3, 5 of 3, 3, 5 of 3. We must be in the key of 3. We must have modulated to the key of 3. So let's pretend that 3 is actually 1. Let's just say that by this point, this is a cadence of some kind. This is a 5-7, and then this is 1. That's the key of A minor. So let's go backwards and try to find where we slipped, where A minor kind of slipped into your DMs. That would make this a cadential 6-4. So 5, 6, 4, which then resolves to 5, 5, 3, as you do. Which then we need a subdominant, right? We can't really modulate unless we have a subdominant in the new key. That would be this chord. That would be 6 in the key of A minor is an F major chord. Okay, so A minor, 6, which was previously 1. All right, so it's actually the same modulation that got us from D flat major into F minor. Liszt is now repeating again here, going from F major into A minor. Okay, so we're in the key of A minor now. So if we followed the pattern from before, we went from D flat major into F minor, and then slipped from F minor into F major. Possible we're going to slip now from A minor into A major. And if we look ahead, you can see this is some sort of 5-7 thing, then the 1 thing, then another 5-7 thing, and then we're in A major now. This is really A major. This is 1, this is 1, this is 1. Whoa, okay. So what would that be? This is a D flat major chord. In the context of A major, that would make it a flat 4, 6, 4. This is not a thing. Okay? If we have flattened 4, if you've written flat 4, stop. That's not possible. That's not a thing. This, I suppose this could be C sharp major respelled into D flat, I guess. So that would be 3 sharp. Like you're racking your brain. It's like getting complicated. Look ahead. See what happens. Okay, so we have a cadence in D flat major. Obviously, if you remember, that's where we started. So again, let's work backwards. See if we can make sense of this. That would make this some sort of a cadential 6/4 in D flat major. Again, D flat major. Goes like this. 7/5/3. So, A natural. What is A natural in the context of D flat major? All right, so let's write this out. We have 5, then we have 1, and then we have this thing that's in an A natural. Do we call that sharp 5? No, definitely not. It can't be sharp 5. Sharp 5 is not a thing. You can't change the root of 1, 4, or 5. You cannot chromatically inflect 1, 4, or 5. Everything just falls apart. So, must be something else. What if we respelled it as 6? Flat 6 is the same, or B double flat is the same. It's the same as A natural. Again, B double flat equals A natural is magic. So see, Liszt has spelled it nicely, kindly for you, the performer. But in the context of D flat major, this would be a B double flat major chord. B double flat, D flat, F flat. Okay, that is a mixture chord that is technically flat 6. It's the 6 chord that comes from D flat minor, but God knows how many flats that key signature has, so Liszt respelled it as A major. And you could also write this as double flat 6. That's how I like to see it, but you know, flat 6 works fine as well. So technically, yes, this is 1 in A major. Sorry, my triangles are looking like little circles. But in the context of D flat major, this is also flat 6. So, using mixture chords as pivots, that's a delicious way to get yourself basically anywhere you want to. Let's look at this progression, this scheme from the beginning. So this was our progression. This was our whole sequence, essentially. A sequence is the operative word here. Okay, so I want you to observe the keys that we went through. We went through D flat major, F major, A major, and then back to D flat major. Like so. D flat, F, A, D flat. And I'll commandeer some of this staff up above just so you can see it clearly. This, as you can see, equal divisions of the octave, which remember, impossible in a diatonic world. But perfectly doable in chromatic land. So again, you see something like this, something that exists, that can only exist in a kind of chromatic conception of music. This is not possible diatonically. Magic. All right. So just a couple more examples. Here's another Liszt example. Beautiful song, Au Quand je dors by Liszt. So we can hear the beginning is basically, very diatonic. So we just assume up here, we're in E major. This is, E major, E major, E major. Something happens here. These couple of bars, right around where the singer sings, as appeared Laura. This is this character that kind of comes back in these songs. But essentially what we have here, this is the 5 of G sharp, right? And then we get a G sharp chord. So, I think it's fair to say that we have something of a cadence here, right? This is a kind of a 1. But then what happens? Then we slip back into E major. This is very short. This is a very short adventure into G sharp major. This is in fact a situation, and actually I should say, we do have enough information to be able to say we're in G sharp major, because if we sort of step backwards, always working backwards from where the cadence is in the new key, we have, from the perspective of G sharp major, a mixture 4 chord, then a 5 chord, then a 1 chord. We are in G sharp major. We could argue this. However, it's so short. It's just 3 bars. So this is a case where I think either just write each chord as it is from the perspective of E major. So 6, then 5, 7 of 3, then we have major 3 sharp, right? That makes sense. I think that's reasonable, because then we get, there are other things going on here, but this whole bar is basically a kind of a 5, 7 from the perspective of E major. If you actually want to acknowledge this moment, this special moment that kind of acts like it's G sharp major, you could, if you wanted, do this kind of special thing where you make a little bracket and then say, okay, if we were in G sharp major, this would be 4, this would be 5, 7, this would be 1. If we were in G sharp major. We're not. It's not long enough. We're not going to call it a modulation, but if we had modulated, this is what these chords would be. Okay, because it's very short. It really doesn't last long enough to say we've really cadenced or modulated. Okay, so if we go on, this bottom system here. Okay, so we have 1, and again, just look for where all the accidentals are. It's like your ambulance chasing. You're looking for where all the action is. We have a mixture 1. Whoa, what the heck is that? Well, if we just take it at face value, this is a flat 6, scale degree 6 of some kind from the perspective of E major on a C, right? So it's a flat 6 of some kind, but it's a minor chord. Usually flat 6, mixture flat 6 in E major would be a C major chord. This is a C minor chord. So this is one of those kind of weird mixture chords where you would write flat 6 flat. Yikes. So if your brain is hurting when you see stuff like this, most likely it's too complicated, right? There's maybe something else going on. So let's keep going. Okay, so now we have, well, I don't know what this is. This is a, 7, 7. Okay, that's weird. Flat 6 flat minor 7 flat 7, like this is getting weird. And now we have a flat 3. Okay, Stop. We've modulated. If you see this much weird stuff in a row, you're in the wrong key. You're like, none of this makes any sense. So let's start from a cadence. Let's find a cadence. Here's a cadence right here. Nice, simple, straightforward. Always go for what's simple. That's what your ear does. So here's 1. Here's 5, 7. Again, working backwards. G major, we're in G major. What would this chord be in G major? This would be 4. Mixture 4. Okay. This chord would be 6. Just a normal diatonic 6. Previous bar, that would be 6 sharp. Okay. The alternative from the perspective of E major is that this bar here is 1. So maybe 6 sharp is too complicated. That's not a good pivot point. What would be a good pivot point is the next bar, because that was minor 1 in E major, and then from the perspective of G major, this was 6. So there's our pivot. Always look for the simplest pivot. And when I say simplest, really what I'm saying is you want the pivot to be strong and stable in both keys, as strong and stable as is possible. If it's not strong and stable in both keys, what you're going to end up with is a modulation that's not convincing. Again, I think I used that analogy before of you want the connection between those two chords in both keys to be, if you had fallen off of a ship, you want someone to throw you a thick rope that you can actually hang on to and not, dental floss. It's too thin. So you want to look for strong connections between both keys. All right, so next example. Okay, so you can see clearly something happens here, right? It's unambiguous. Schumann puts a double bar and he puts sharps, and we were previously in flats. And remember, sharps and flats, they are conceived of as very different entities in the 19th century. So we end up all right. So what kind of modulation is this? There, as with most things in tonal harmony, there's always a few ways to cut it. Really, there's two. We could think of this if we're in A-flat major. We could think of this E-flat major chord, or E major chord, if we respelled E major as F-flat major. That's flat 6 from the point of view of A-flat major. That's possible. Flat 6, we could do that. That could be our pivot. Then the perspective of E major, this is 1. That makes sense. The other explanation, and we saw this in the Schubert example earlier, and I think this is really the way Schumann is thinking. We have this A-flat here on top of the A-flat major chord, which then becomes the third. A-flat equals G sharp, which means magic. Oops, that's not how magic is spelled. Magic. Which becomes the third in E major. Okay, so again, this is a common tone modulation. Okay, very cool. Very kind of, they're really just juxtapositions. It's not a modulation even. It's like we were in this key, and now we're in this key. And, deal with it. And now we're in this key. They all share this note, at least to our ears. Okay? And we can see here in this passage, we're really in E major. We've gotten tonic, subdominant, dominant. Okay, so two possible explanations, either with a pivot chord, a mixture pivot chord, or common tone modulation. So now let's go back. We're going back to A-flat major. just such great music. All right, so let's look here. We've kind of ended up in 4 in this E major bit. So this is all kind of in the region of 4. We have a 4-7 chord here. So how do we get from a 4-7 chord in E major to, and we're now in A-flat major, we now have a 5-7 chord. Like, how do we pivot those things? Is this, call this a flat 5? Do we call this a flat 2? I guess we could call that a flat 2. I mean, that's a possibility. We could think of this as, I guess I should write this down just to sort of show the thought process. I have a punchline here, of course. So we have an A major chord, and then we have an E flat 7 chord, which is then going to cadence an A flat major. So we know this is 5-7. We know this is 1. We have our A major chord. What's a potential relationship between, I mean, if we respell this as a B double flat major chord, man, we saw that recently. From the point of view of A flat major, technically that's flat 2, right? So this is kind of a Neapolitan. This is actually a 7 chord, isn't it? So we have a flat 2-7. Right, it's kind of a Neapolitan thing. That's a possibility. You could definitely say that right here, this chord is 4-7 from the perspective of E major, but from the perspective of A flat major, it's flat 2-7. Okay? Totally possible. But also, let's look at the voice leading. Let's look at the notes in the chord. We see we have C sharps here. C sharp, C sharp, C sharp turns into D flat. C sharp equals D flat. It's the 3rd of this chord, which is now the 7th of this chord. So this is another situation where you could, in fact, say that this is a common tone modulation. Because it's so prominent, that common tone. And that's from the listener's perspective, that's the mechanism that Schumann is using to connect these two harmonic worlds. If it was less obvious, like we were down here or something like that, where the connections between tones wasn't as obvious, maybe at that point I would advocate, like, okay, this is a pivot chord sort of thing. But really, I think that would be bad writing anyway. And really, this is what Schumann is driving home, this C sharp equals D flat, which, again, magic. There's one more thing I want to show you. I'm going to tack this onto the end because at this point we've broken everything, right? If you can say that C sharp and D flat are the same note, then basically, you know, everything else kind of breaks. So let me show you an example of what happens when you break things. Now we start thinking, and again, this is what I meant at the beginning when I said this is going to be a prelude to what comes next, to post-tonal theory. When you say that C sharp and D flat are the same note, you are actually weirdly reducing the number of possible notes you can work with. Remember that diatonic music it's almost infinite, right? Because all the various intervals that are constructed out of their own unique primes, when you stack them together, they kind of spin off into infinity. You can't stack 3 pure major thirds and expect to get an octave. They just never meet up. So you have this kind of infinite number of intervals, theoretically anyway, in the diatonic realm. In the chromatic realm, once we say that C sharp and D flat are the same note, Now, technically speaking, we really only have 12 notes. Truly. And it actually doesn't matter how I spell these. I could spell them any old way I want. What matters is that we have 12 points in space. Right? These are 12 discrete, quantized points in space. And they are measurable by this distance, this exact distance, which has a mathematical formula. And the mathematical formula is the 12th root of 2 is this. That is literally the measurable quanta. 2, meaning the octave, divided into 12 equal parts. And we need this crazy, irrational mathematics in order to actually figure out what that number is. And that number is 1.59463094359295, etc., etc., etc. It goes on to infinity. This is very different from the very nice, neat numbers that we got with diatonic intervals. So there's a kind of weird irony here. Like these nice, neat ratios, this is 3 to 2, that's the perfect fifth. That gives us this number, 1.5. But if you stack infinite numbers of perfect fifths, you're never going to come back to where you started. You'll never end up on that same note. It's just, you have to go to infinity to come back. Ironically, these discrete quanta, in order to divide an octave, for example, into discrete measurable parts, you need a number that goes into infinity in order to have those discrete quanta. So they're kind of opposites. That's what I mean by chromaticism. This is chromaticism. This is diatonicism. But chromaticism is measurable and diatonicism is almost immeasurable. There's spiritual implications there that I don't think I can get into. But once we're measuring things in semitones, in half steps, in these 12th root of 2 measurements, it means we can start breaking things. We can start doing things that we actually have no way to really describe in diatonic terms. Let me give you an example of something that you know, which I will then help you to unknow. So here's a chord progression that you know. Okay, so you know this. This is the famous Pachelbel canon. This is very much, the diatonic kind of sequence. We have a sequence here, groups of 2 notes, starts on 1, we kind of go through 6 and then 4, and this is very nice and neat. There's a chromatic answer to the sequence, a chromatic sequence, we could say. And this is where we start to be very literal, like painfully literal about exactly what we're doing. So we go down 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 semitones. So -5. Then 0, 1, 2, +2. Okay. Then let's go down 5 semitones again. -5. Okay. F sharp. Now +2. We have G sharp. Now down 5 semitones. -5 +2. Down 5 semitones. sharp, and then up 2 semitones. Gets us back to D. Interesting. So what you can see here is equal divisions of the octave. So let's harmonize this. Let's start it the way we expect it to, right? Okay. This is normal so far. And the pattern starts over. Okay, this is already getting kind of funky. Okay, then if we follow this pattern again, a major triad built off of that bass note. Okay, now we're getting into the realm of I don't want to write that many accidentals, so I'm going to respell it. This is where the piano is your friend. And then back to where we started. So, play this. What key are we in? Kind of doesn't matter anymore. And we have a chromatic sequence. None of this is giving us any diatonically useful information. All that matters is the pattern, right? This pattern, as it repeats like this, where we started and where we exited. Whatever happens in between, between you and God, you could say. So if this is 1 and this is 1, everything in between is a chromatic sequence. What kind? Again, I don't care about the names, I just care that the pattern repeats. Down 5 semitones, up 2 semitones, down 5, up 2, down 5, up 2. Remember, semitones, not scale degrees, semitones. Because the scale we're working with now is the chromatic scale, the 12 notes of the chromatic scale. This, previously we had 7. We had 7 notes in the diatonic scale. Now we have 12. This unlocks a whole lot of crazy things that can happen, even in the middle of a diatonic progression. So let's say we have, I'll just write something fairly straightforward. Let's do C major, 1, 2, 6, 5, 5. And then we're going to end up with 1 eventually. But in between here and here, I want to have a chromatic sequence. I want to prolong 5 using some sort of a chromatic sequence, some sort of a chromatic pattern. It could be the same sequence as this up here. And in fact, let's just do that. And actually let me transpose this up so that we can end up, so if we're thinking of this chord as 5, that means we're in G major. So just so I don't have to write all that out again. 5, stuff happens, 1. All right, so let's hear that. you can really insert a moment of quite bizarre activity. And really, we've prolonged 5, but we've prolonged it with, again, magic. Anytime we have a chromatically based pattern, chromatically based alterations, chromatically based respellings, we take a G sharp, turning it into an A flat, magic. Let's play that one more time. You can make up basically any chromatic sequence that you can dream up, essentially, so long as you know where you're going to enter and where you're going to exit, and you have patterns that repeat inside, and I'll show you one that I made up. Some other interesting ones that you will often see are 5. And now I'm going to descend 2 semitones at a time. So this is going to be our sequence, and then 1. Okay. Okay, so I had a B flat major chord, then a G flat major chord. So we started on a D major chord. Yeah. And then D major, then 1. So as you can see, we went from, I'll write this out, D to B flat to G flat to D, again, equal divisions of the octave, which is diatonically impossible. Play that one more time. So as you can hear, it's like basically diatonically functionless. There's no diatonic function in here. I'm not going to call this like flat 3 and flat 1. Like, it just doesn't make any sense. There is no rhyme or reason to it, even less so than diatonic sequences. So let me show you a chromatic sequence that I made up in my Teasdale setting that I think is kind of interesting, and just to sort of show you the extent to which you can take this. So I'm going to jump ahead to this middle section here. So this piece is in A major. We start here, A major, and this is essentially a kind of a flat 6/6 with some, neighbor tones, essentially. What we have here is kind of a 5/6/5 of 4. This is an A dominant 7th chord, which in the context of A major is the dominant of D major. Keep that in mind. So we have a D flat major chord. Okay, so at this point, we could try to think of some, like, what is D flat major in the context of A major, right? We could do those mental gymnastics, which, it would be 3 sharp, but respelled, right? So now it's D flat major. So let's look ahead. Now we have an A flat major chord, so that's the 5 of D flat major. So let's just pretend this is D flat, which means this is 1. Now this is 5/6. Okay, so 5/6, that should resolve back to D flat, but have a C major chord. Okay. So in the context of D flat major, that's a 7 natural 5 natural 3. Oh my god, what do I stop. If you're having to do this much labor, maybe something else is going on. Most importantly is we have a C in this chord, right? A common tone. Okay, so there's a common tone connection here. And actually we have this is a dominant 7th chord. And that connection is actually up here as well, the C sharp in the A flat major chord to the D flat. Okay, so starting to look for patterns. You can kind of see some patterns, right? So definitely we have a 1 to 5 relationship here. But then we also have these common tone relationships. And then again, E to E. Another common tone. Okay. Okay, this chord is the 5 of that chord. So in the context of E major, this would be 1, and this would be 5. Okay, that's something. All right, now we have an E flat chord. So D sharp equals E flat. There's a common tone. Now let's look at what the next chord is. A G major chord. We have a G in this chord, which is also in this chord. So we have another common tone connection. And then another 5 to 1 relationship, right? And then you hear my daughter in the background. Possibly that's how your brains feel at the moment. I'll show you. This looks simpler than it sounds as I'm describing it. We're back in A major with a sort of a, cadential 6/4 sounding thing. So let's just say this is our cadential 6/4. Whatever comes next, doesn't matter. Remember D major from before, right? This chord is the 5/7 of 4. Here's our 4 chord. Okay, so long term, where a whole bunch of stuff happens in between that we can't really keep track of, but long term is something sensible. So let's look at this progression as it actually plays out. I'll write it out for you. We have this becomes this. Becomes this. Okay, so if we look at the pattern, it's essentially like this. And actually, let me respell this so that it looks like something familiar. Okay, so we started with something 5/7 of 4, chromatic sequence for and then 5. And so on. Let me just play this for you so you can hear the progression. So I'll start in bar 13 there. Etc. And because this passage here is essentially about something that is distant, that's far away, that's almost magical, mythical, kind of without grounding in your own current reality, this sort of a chromatic sequence that's based entirely on chromatic connections, chromatic common tones, respellings, and a sort of a sequential pattern. It makes sense musically because we float. We're no longer grounded to diatonic harmony. Okay, so if that melted your brain a little bit, that's the point. That's what these ideas are meant to do. They're meant to dissociate you musically and sort of put you in a position where you're just kind of floating. You're not, gravity no longer applies. Okay, I will now actually leave it there. Have a wonderful break and have fun with these.